Thank you. And just to kind of go off of what Molly was saying, it is because of my associations with the Utah Cut Flower Growers Association that um, I am presenting here to you today. I was able to work with Melanie Stock, and we will also be presenting with two high school students that worked for me for the summer and kind of tagged on to this research and got really excited. And they'll tell you more about themselves in a moment. But this research is being funded by the Western SARE. So just to kind of tell you a little bit about my farm, Roo Crew Farms was started in 2022 when I wanted a dairy cow really bad. And my husband told me, absolutely not, but I will compromise and you can have a garden. So I started with a 1,200 square foot garden. The next year, I was like, well, that's just not enough. And so I grew 6 beds and then it grew again and grew again. And this year, I will be growing on 6 acres. And on the map, you can see kind of the layout of how my farm is. My husband is a farmer, but he farms primarily dry land, and oddly enough, the irrigated farm is kind of annoying. So yeah, he's very supportive, but now he jokes that he should have just got the dairy cow. I grow predominantly cut flowers and then some root vegetables. I have a 1 1/3 acre under drip irrigation, and the rest is flood irrigation right now. Um, I primarily sell wholesale, so to grocery stores, restaurants, and then to wholesale distributors. And I employ 14 to 18-year-old students, and they kind of take care of all the things.
Okay, this is just a little bit about Abbie and I. We are both seniors at South Summit High School. We're both FFA officers. Abbie is one of the chapter vice presidents, and I'm the reporter. We chose this objective because we wanted to know which weed control method would make the most money. Also, we are doing an ag science fair project where we will have to present this information to judges at FFA State Convention in March.
So, what we really researched on this project, oh, sorry, Abbie, that was you. I'm sorry.
It's okay. So what we researched was which weed control method results in the highest quality sunflowers, what weeds are being controlled, and which method resulted in the highest profit margin, which was what me and Jaydin researched.
Okay. The research was conducted through the 2025 growing season on 5 160-foot rows per succession. Plants were planted 4 inches apart and drip tape with 6 inch meter spacing.
Data was collected in 2 foot by 2 foot collection boxes, and they were placed at the same point in each treatment row, and the data collectors would count what weeds were present and the sunflower populations each box had each week, and the data was then averaged across for the entire row. These results are only from 1 year data, and then we also planted using the Wizard D20 precision vacuum drill, and then we fertilized.
The weed control methods tried were sulfentrazone, hand weeding, trifluralin, wool, and straw. Both sulfentrazone and trifluralin were applied immediately after seeding, as per the label. We waited until sunflower seedlings had 2 true leaves to hand weed and apply the wool and straw. We waited so that the plants would have adequate time to grow prior to implanting a mulch layer. We waited to hand weed all to allow germination to take place and for them to get established prior to potential disturbance and with hand weeding crews.
Thanks, Jane and Abbie, for laying that foundation. So the first objective, as Abbie mentioned, was which weed control method results in the highest quality sunflowers. So one of the reason that we looked into this is one of the chemicals that we used is in like commercial seed production, not bloom production for sunflowers. And so I was just our main question was, will this impact the quality of the stems? And what we found was actually really interesting. So as we seeded the same amount with that precision drill in every row, but there was higher germ rates in some rows than others. For example, well, we noticed that if we had a population density of more than 40 stems per 2-foot box, then our bloom size was smaller. And that resulted in us having to market them differently. So we marketed them as bunches of 10 stems to be support stems instead of those big focal sunflowers. Also, please note that my sunflower pricing system is a little different because I am targeting, like, I move like a lot of stems rather than just a couple of bunches to a florist here and there. For objective 2, we wanted to know what weeds specifically were being controlled by the different weed treatments. As you can see from the table, red root pigweed, lamb's quarter, and other were our biggest problems. So other is really helpful. So when we went back through the trials and I had my data collectors write, well, what weeds are you seeing if they're not specifically listed? And we noticed field bindweed, which, as we all know, is the bane of existence, and common mallow were significant. And so we will be looking at those more specifically in the 2026 growing season as we replicate this data again.
Okay, so Jaydin and I researched to find which weed control method was the most financially viable for commercial operation. We wanted to find out which method didn't only kill the weeds, but find which one allowed us to keep the most money after all the costs.
Okay, your fixed expenses are like your seeds, your drip irrigation, your planting, and harvesting. So, and then our variable expenses would be for hand weeding, it'd be the labor to pull the weeds, and the sulfentrazone and trifluralin would be purchasing the chemical and then applying it. And then the wool and the straw were just like applying and removing.
So I just want to add a little bit here. The reason that we had to remove the wool after we harvested the sunflowers off of that row was because we tried one time and it bound up the tiller real bad. So then we had to go back in and remove the wool so that we could work that ground again and get our next crop in.
Okay, so here we're talking about our gross cells. As you see, when there got to be more than 40 blooms in a box, the bloom size became too small and wasn't big enough to be able to sell for the 75 cents. So we had to mark those down, which resulted in a lower gross sales. And so, therefore, our highest gross sale was sulfentrazone, and the straw was our lowest gross sales.
Okay, and then so the way you get your net income, which is like the money you make off of it, is you take your gross minus your expenses, and then that's how you get those numbers. And then we had the sulfentrazone obviously ranked as number 1, and then the straw ranked as number 5.
So for the best overall method to have the most profit, we suggest sulfentrazone, but if you want to stay in the organic method, wool is recommended to avoid the chemicals, but sulfentrazone is the best overall method.
Then, so high plant density led to smaller blooms, dropping the price from 75 cents to 50 cents per stem. And then, like, a way you can fix this would be spacing the seeds to make sure we get larger blooms to sell at a premium price.
And then the other impact that we noticed was labor. So obviously your hand weeding crews are going to cost a lot more than your chemical and the cost to apply the chemical. And so just looking at different ways that you can expedite that, like can you use like a mechanical hand weeding treatment or something of that variety? So what are we going to do differently for 2026? Some things will stay the same. For example, we're still going to do 1 row with each treatment type. We're still going to use the 6-inch emitter spacing drip tape. We are going to space the seeds a little differently. So the drill setting allows me to adjust the spacing up to 4.9 inches in between seeds. So for every pass on my drill, I have 2 rows, but they're able to plant 4 rows per hopper, if that makes sense. And so I can go up to 4.9, almost 5 inches in between that. And we think Well, we're hoping that by expanding that spacing, we'll be able to get that higher premium on all of the stems rather than just those with the chemical. And then obviously with our weed population, we're going to pay more attention and look at the other weeds that we noticed in 2025 and make sure that we're collecting actual data on those crops so that we're able to have a reflective data set showing us what weeds specifically were controlled. Retrospectively, I wish that we would have done a row where we did absolutely nothing to see how the weed treatment methods were comparing. And then looking to the future, we always, as we're doing these studies, we always look at, well, what about this? And what about this? And what is happening with the next thing? And I think it would be really interesting to look at how the different weed treatments are impacting the soil. For example, we know that chemicals can put salts into the soil and they can cause damage to the microbiome. Well, if we're putting such little amounts, for example, with the sulfetrazone, it was like a quarter of a teaspoon per 160-foot row with 2 gallons of water. So is that small of amount really impacting the soil the way that we've been reading? And where we're implementing crop rotation, are we seeing that build up? What are the impacts that the straw and the wool are having? For example, we know that wool can put nitrogen into the soil as it is irrigated. It can leach nitrogen into the soil, but is it having an effect on the salinity, and what impacts is it truly having on the soil? Another thing we could look at is, would a combination of these methods yield more desirable results? Could we get even more of a premium on our plants if we were able to control more weeds to get those sunflower densities and the bloom sizes where we needed them? For example, if we combine sulfetrazone and wool, for example, or hand weeding with wool. And then where is that inflection point where our profit and our yield are crossing, and we're maximizing on both fronts? And then lastly, where can we cut expenses in other areas? Can we be more efficient in processing? Can we use different materials as mulch? For example, red beets are a significant crop on my operation, and when we top those beets to get them ready for market, the greens just kind of go into the compost heap, and that's the end of their life, basically. But could we be using those as a mulch? And what impact would that have on our crops and our soil? We were a little short on time, but are there any questions?
Wow, thank you so much for that presentation, Calee, Jaydin, and Abbie. I just have to say that if I could give a talk like Jaydin and Abbie did in high school, I don't even know where I'd be at now. I'm so blown away by this study and the three of you working together and presenting this way. So thank you. I think our audience shares that too. We so far have a couple of questions in the Q&A, and so if anyone else wants to add some, please do. Because we have a great time here now for discussion. So the first question is just to better understand some of the herbicides that you used. Were these chemicals used on any other crop than sunflowers? Could you maybe just tell us more about them?
Yeah, so Treflan, we'll talk about that one first because it's probably the more wider known. If you've ever heard of preen, it's the liquid version of preen. So it's used in a lot of landscaping type things and just to control weeds. So it would work really great on transplanting. And then there are some crops that can come up through the Treflan and a lot of crops that cannot. So it would work great with transplanting, and then you would just have to read the label. I'm not sure what other crops are on that one specifically. Sulfetrazone is a little more targeted. Aquesta 4F or Spartan are some of the names that we hear with that. But that is typically used in commercial safflower production, commercial sunflower production, or mustard, I think. I can't remember what the other crop that's on that label, but it's more specific to this type of crop. It is also a pre-emergent, so you have to kind of be a little more cognizant of where you are, and it has a longer withdrawal period. For example, I have to wait a longer amount a longer amount of time unless I add a lot of water or till before I can plant my next crop back into the sulfetrazone chemical.
Thank you for that extra information. The next question is, did you have any Russian thistle in your weeds? Can you recommend a control method?
Russian thistles are basically awful. I do not have that problem on my farm. My husband does on his farm, and he is able to control the Russian thistle with the sulfetrazone.
Thank you. The next question is, did you get any pushback from customers about not being organic?
I did not. So I market to wholesalers specifically. So if you've heard of like JFS and some of those groups, they don't ask because they're used to getting crops from like Ecuador where there aren't standard practices, and organic methods and such are not as important or standard practice. I don't really sell to like direct to consumer necessarily, isn't my target market, and so I did not see any pushback. If that was your primary market, maybe if they ask, but like I said, you're putting a quarter of a teaspoon on a 2 foot by 160 foot row. So like the amount that you're using is so negligible. I don't know.
All right, thank you. I just want to take a minute because you're getting a lot of compliments, and I want to share them. They're very sweet. Some of them are in the chat, so not everybody can see them. But kudos on the thorough research by the young farmers in Calee. Good luck with on your science fairs and competitions. Thank you for this study. It seems like sunflower patches and fields are always covered with pests. This is helpful information. And then the next is a part question. I'm curious which FFA contest you're competing in with this study. It's a really great way to help youth and connect to community through flower farms.
Abbie and Jaydin, that's you.
So like it's an ag science fair where we go and we present to a panel of judges about our research. We had to write like a research essay on it and submit that, and we had to make a poster, and we're gonna like use that poster as a way to like explain like our research to the panel of judges.
Wow, that is such wonderful training that you're receiving through this program that is undoubtedly going to set you up so well in the future too, not to mention be able to share these results more widely. So that's wonderful to hear. Next question is, where do you purchase your seed from?
So a couple of different places. I typically go through GeoSeed. I've gone through Harris Seed, and I've gone through a company called Sunflower Selections. So I kind of just bid out, and then whichever is the best price, that's where I go.
I'm going to ask, when you showed how your farm size has grown over the years, and so what is it, 6 acres that you had here in 2026? What are the plans for 2027?
My husband's afraid to know.
We shouldn't publicly talk about this yet. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll have to see how the 6 acres go before we go to the next.
Okay. That's wise. So this next question, she said, is a little off topic of the presentation, but how does your flood irrigation work? Mine is less effective, and I can't find much info on how to improve it.
So I'm gonna go back to, no, I'm not. It's not gonna let me. That's fine. So I have a pond that then has a pump, and then it's delivered via alfalfa valves. So where I'm farming was an alfalfa field. And so they're about 12-inch head gates, and I just like swivel them open, and then they just kind of flood, and then I just let them water. And like that was a really bad explanation, but that's how I do it.
Have there been any things that you've done on your farm to optimize flood irrigation? Have you had to level the land or
Yes, so we
anything?
did do a land leveling last year. And so last year my husband, he grew cattle forage and baled it. And then this year it's being converted into my more of my flower slash veggie farm. But yeah, it was land leveled to help it just get across more efficiently. We do have a meter, and then the pump. The pump is really convenient because I can turn it on and off from my phone, so I can set the head gates and then water at those optimal times. So that's really convenient. Um, but yeah, it's more about flow and how long it can stay on the field. So if you can have your flood stay on there longer, that seems to work better. We did notice that we needed to wait. So, okay, how we plant now is not how we planted when we first started drip. So when we first started, we would plant and then turn the flood irrigation on, and then all of our seeds would just wash to the end of the row, and it was super awesome. Now we water about 3 days before we drill, and then we have to wait until those plants come up before we flood again, so that they're kind of anchored so that we don't just wash our crop away. We also, because of the volume of flow we get at once, we have about a 10 to 15 foot buffer between our first crops and the head gate. I don't know if that's helpful. If you could provide more information as to how your flooding system works, I could maybe tailor that more to what you're doing.
No, thank you. I think that those were great general recommendations for trying to optimize flood irrigation. And Michelle, if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to throw them in the Q&A. The next question is, what county are you in?
Box Elder.
She's right on the other side of the mountain for me. So we have a few minutes left. Please, if you have any other questions, add them in. Otherwise, I'm going to be asking Calee some questions. And I'm just curious, so we're doing a wool study here at USU as well. And so in looking at your yield numbers, so there were different planting densities or spacing. So was the straw and the wool planted at the same spacing?
Yes. So all of our crops were planted at the same spacing. Like all the sunflowers were planted on the same settings. And I'm not really sure what impacted that. I don't even know how you'd go about researching what impacted that.
Well,
But
it's so interesting that the yield was different, that it was what, 47 for wool and 40 for straw, for example. It's kind of comparable mulches.
yeah, yeah,
Huh.
it was weird. As
What
I
do
was
you
putting in the data, running it, I was going, what the crap happened there? Like,
Yeah, well, that's a great reason for doing the research. What do you, so with your plans for this year in optimizing, how do you think that is going to pencil out then between the different weed control measures by having the wider spacing so that you can have the larger diameter sunflowers and potentially higher price point then?
I mean, it's possible that the wool could come out on top, even over the chemicals. It all comes back to that labor cost, right? So
Yeah.
it's hard to if if they yield the same, chemical will win every year. But if they don't yield the same and we get a higher yield on the wool, well, then I mean, my husband will be really excited when I just start bringing home a bunch of sheep so that I can have the wool.
No
But
cows, so bring the sheep over, right?
exactly. No, the and as far as resourcing wool, how I've kind of got that is we have a lot of kids that show in the local fair, and so I've reached out to them, and then just some family friends that have sheep is where I get my wool. But I would start if you're interested in using wool as a mulch, which from my data, we're going to try it on some other crops as well this year. But I would start with your local FFA and 4-H kids.
And so it wasn't a deal breaker for you then in terms of running equipment and having to remove the wool?
It wasn't for me because at the end of the season, we have because my husband farms, he has large equipment. So he brought in his big harrow and then he just kind of moves the wool all around. I mean, obviously, if I'm using that volume year after year after year, am I planting in soil or am I planting in wool? I don't know. But it would be interesting to see how that kind of works.
Yeah. Oh, we've got some more questions popping up. So do you have a problem with rodents like gophers eating your drip pipes? Have you got a suggestion for controlling them?
So I don't, so because how I control rodents in my drip irrigation system is probably not the best, but it has worked for us. And I know that it may not be an option for everyone. I do have those flood irrigation valves. So at the end of the season, when everything's done, I just pop those open and flood the fields, and that seems to take care of my rodent problem. We do have a couple of troughs where they have eaten through lines, and I don't know how you fix it. If someone figures that out, I know a lot of people with cattle that would pay a lot of dollars to figure that solution out.
All right. What seems to affect the demand for sunflowers of different types and sizes?
So for us, we didn't move a lot of the 10 stem bunches because people typically want the focal sunflower. Like when they think of the sunflower, they want the big focal. So we didn't move a ton of the smaller ones, but a few. And then I think what pushes the demand, I mean, it's like every other flower, it's trend. We don't move a lot of specialty sunflowers to our wholesale customers. Um, Traditionally, florists are looking for those traditional sunflowers in from what I'm seeing. Um, I do work with some florists as I'm always trying new crops and have smaller quantities of certain crops. And so I will work with some florists and they'll gravitate more towards those specialties. But even then, the whites are usually a good bet. Every once in a while, you'll find a bride that likes them. But sunflowers are hard crop because they're more market bouquet than bridal and elevated. And so they're kind of a tricky crop to market, if you will.
That's very helpful.